Oxidative phosphorylation is the third and final stage of cellular respiration. And we do consider this to be the most productive stage, and that really is in terms of the amount of ATP that's actually produced from this. So it does produce about 90% of the total ATP that we actually get with the whole cellular respiration process. So this definitely really is a very important part of cellular respiration. We do break this stage of respiration into two different halves. We have one part which is going to be called the electron transport chain. And then we have the other part which is called chemiosmosis. Now with these two, the electron transport chain is going to release the energy from the collected electrons. And since we are releasing energy in that case, overall this will be an exergonic process. And then if we talk about the chemiosmosis part, the chemiosmosis is going to be responsible for making ATP. And that's why we're going to get so much ATP made during this last phase. And since we're making ATP, that is going to be endergonic. And these two processes, they do rely on each other. And so this exergonic process here is going to be used to power this endergonic process here. And that's what we tend to refer to as energy coupling. And energy coupling is anytime we're using an exergonic process to get the energy that we need to power an endergonic process. This is something that happens all of the time inside of the cell. The electron transport chain part of oxidative phosphorylation, as we mentioned, is going to be used to release the energy that is stored in those collected electrons. So recall that prior to this, we collected electrons in the form of NADH and also FADH2s. So we had a number of these electron carriers that we actually produced during glycolysis and then also in the citric acid cycle. And really, to be specific about it, we got 10 NADHs total from those two stages. And then we also got 2 FADHs that we can add to that. And these right here, these are the starting materials for the third stage of respiration. So we definitely want to understand that. We kept counting these up before because these are our starting materials. So what we're going to have happen here is that those electron carriers are going to do what electron carriers do. And that means that they are going to take those electrons that they have and they're going to pass them to other electron carriers. Now, if we think of this in an energy diagram, so this is my amount of energy over here on the y-axis, and NADH is going to be way up here at the top of this. What NADH is going to do is it's going to come along and it's going to pass its electrons to another molecule. So I'm just going to draw this other molecule like this. And when NADH does that, it passes its electrons on. It is actually getting oxidized, so it's going to lose its electrons. And in that case, it will turn back into NAD+. Well, once those electrons have been passed on, now this new electron carrier that we drew has those electrons. However, notice that that electron carrier is a little bit lower on the energy diagram. So notice it's a little lower, which means it has a little less potential energy than NADH had way up here at the top. So the difference is, at least as far as my diagram is concerned, it's about that much right there. So since we went from having this amount down to having this amount, that would be a little exergonic reaction that we had just take place. So since it is an exergonic reaction, any exergonic reaction is going to release energy. So a small amount of energy is going to be released in that one little step or that one little redox reaction. Then what's going to happen is we will have another electron carrier here, and this one is going to pass the electrons on to that one, and when it passes them on, it will become oxidized as well. And now notice again that we have dropped just a little bit in energy. And so since we have dropped just a little bit in energy, we will see that again, there's going to be a little bit of energy that comes out. So when we talk about the electron transport chain, and I'm just going to draw some more electron carriers in here, the electron transport chain, it is a collection of electron carriers that each have progressively smaller amounts of potential energy. And that really is a key point here, because as we continue to pass these electrons on, which is exactly what we're going to do with each passing step would be considered a redox reaction, and each passing step is going to release a tiny amount of energy. So we'll have lots of little steps where we get small amounts of energy. And at the very end of this electron transport chain is a very important molecule, and that's oxygen gas, or O2. And O2 is going to basically be the last one that gets the electrons. And when oxygen gas comes in and gets the electrons, it itself turns into water. So water will be a byproduct in this whole process. And that really is why you see water on the product side of the cellular respiration equation. Here we have another look at the electron transport chain, but here we're seeing it as it actually is inside of the cell. So this electron transport chain, and I'm abbreviating it as ETC, it is embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And so this electron transport chain is made up of a series of proteins, and each one of these proteins is embedded in that membrane, and collections of those proteins are known as complexes. And that's why in this picture we're seeing complex 1, complex 2, complex 3, and complex 4 finally. But notice what we have down here at the bottom. So here we see NADH and also FADH2. They come over to the complex and they pass their electrons in. So as the electrons go to the complex, notice that we regenerate these oxidized electron carriers. Now, another thing to notice about this is that this happens to be the mitochondrial matrix. That is the part of the mitochondria shown in pink here. And recall that the citric acid cycle is down here in the matrix. And that really is where we would have produced the vast majority of those electron carriers anyway. So all that they have to do once we get the NADH and the FADH2 is they just make their way over a little bit to the inner membrane of the mitochondria, pass the electrons in, and then they are oxidized and they can return back to the citric acid cycle where they can get some more electrons. Now, if we continue to follow our picture, those electrons get passed to the first complex, and we said that with each passing step, a small amount of energy is released. So as the electrons are passed, we definitely want to understand that small amounts of energy are released. So now we want to talk about what we're going to do with that small amount of energy that was just released, because that was an exergonic reaction. So what that energy is going to be used for is that is going to be used to actively move hydrogen ions, or H+, across the membrane. And anytime we actively move something, that means that we are moving it up its concentration gradient. So in other words, we're going to move it from an area where it is at a low concentration to an area where it is in a high concentration. And if you notice here, the intermembrane space is going to have a high hydrogen concentration, and the matrix down here is going to have a low hydrogen concentration. So if we wanted to move something up its concentration gradient, we are going to move these from the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. The complexes are going to do that with the energy that they are getting when those electrons are passed on. So again, it's energy coupling here because actively moving is going to require energy, so that would be endergonic. And then the actual passing of the electrons is going to be exergonic. So we use the energy to power something that requires it. So these complexes are all going to do some of this moving of hydrogen ions across the membrane. And that is going to result in there being this big concentration difference. So the end result is that we get a hydrogen gradient. We have a number of terms to refer to that. Sometimes it's called the proton motive force because there is energy stored anytime you have a gradient. And this is going to create quite a large gradient across the membrane. Another thing to point out here is that this whole process is going to be like an assembly line. In an assembly line, you need every individual to do their part. And if you have one person in the middle that does not do their part, the whole thing is going to shut down. And that is what we would have happen here. So if one of these complexes in the middle, for example, did not work anymore, then that means that the previous complex would not be able to pass the electrons in. So that's going to be blocked. And you would essentially back up the electron transport chain, which means that ultimately the whole thing is going to shut down. If we look at where oxygen is in all of this, oxygen is the very last molecule to collect the electrons. So a lot of times we call it the last or the final electron acceptor. That role is crucial to keep this whole thing going. So if you do not have oxygen there to collect electrons, then you do also shut down that electron transport chain. Because again, even the last person in the assembly line is very crucial to keeping that assembly line flowing. So we constantly need to inhale oxygen and have it available to collect these electrons at the very end of this electron transport chain.